security, like why is security, why is, what's your take on the current state of, security and IoT?
Yeah. I
It's-
mean, great question, right? There's a lot of questionable decisions from questionable products out there. Fortunately for me, I work at probably one of the most well-respected vendors in kind of the space that we work in, and so we have the luxury to choose projects that we can feel good about and feel proud of,
yeah,
and that means that we do put a lot of focus onto the securing of devices that we're working with, and that goes everything from the cloud level to the connection between the device and the cloud to the actual software running on the device, making sure that the hardware even on the device is going to be harder to access. So a ton of the like full spectrum of security things for those devices. The largest state of the world is I'd say is probably less in that camp, unfortunately, because there's a lot of companies that want to make cheap products quickly, and usually to them that means cutting out important pieces and steps that secure those products. um, yeah, but I'm glad I can avoid that.
yeah, no, and I think it's a challenge too, and my background coming, I worked as a software engineer in the public sector.
Mm,
And especially, one of the things we always said is, if you're trying to protect everything, you're really protecting nothing, right? And if you look at IoT, I mean, we're talking about billions of different devices, right? Like
yeah.
it's a huge challenge, and I think, I guess I shouldn't say I think, because I'm not as much in that space, but my hope is that we will get there, right? As technologists, we continue to push and solve problems, and those are the things that we go after. So, um, kind of in that specific realm, are there certain technologies
Mhm.
that you're really interested in right now, that you're, if somebody's out there in the audience looking at this and like, man,
Mhm.
I'm excited
Yeah.
about, IoT, or I'm excited about cloud architect. What specific technologies would you recommend for them to start looking at and playing with?
Yeah, great question. I actually I just answered some reader questions related to this on my blog that I can send you later. But questions coming in about both how to get started in IoT, but also how to start securing devices and what are the good services to look at. Um, I wrote two pretty full-fledged guides on two services on different cloud providers that I think are good starting points for that. In AWS, the kind of starting point is AWS IoT Core, which handles a lot of the dealing with getting the secure connections between devices in the cloud, figuring out what permissions they have inside AWS to access particular AWS resources. For example, if they need to send information to a database inside of AWS, or they need to access some service somewhere, or you need to create rules to trigger on different pieces of information flowing in through the devices to the cloud. All that sort of configuration happens in AWS IoT Core. And they have a ton of other services related to their IoT devices, but that's kind of one of the key starting points there. And then in Azure, there's Azure IoT Hubs, which are pretty much a similar service for Azure and any devices you're working with there, where you're going to be able to register those devices inside of Azure either manually or automatically, depending on how your manufacturing process goes. And then once they're in there and they're registered, they can communicate potentially back and forth between the cloud and the device and take actions, and you can run commands on them. There's a bunch of great stuff you can do. Uh, and then there's kind of like one other piece that works both in the Azure and the AWS realm, which is how you kind of get that setup for those devices going in the first place. So say you have 1,000 IoT devices coming out of manufacturing somewhere in the world where you're manufacturing devices. Well, you need to be able to have those from their fresh state to interact with your cloud, and connect to everything that you built. And to do that, you have to figure out, are you going to have uh, X509 certificates that you provision on the devices? Are these certificates going to have special chips that have their own unique identities kind of included inside of these chips that allow them to connect to the cloud? There's a few different considerations to make there, but both platforms support being able to securely connect using those kind of more advanced and secure methods of authentication. Yeah.
So let me kind of help me out
Hmm.
a little bit with this. I'm trying to think. So I know in the big data space, there's a debate, right? And I mean, and the debate goes back to, open source versus proprietary, all the way back in other fields. But I'm seeing it a good bit in big data and analytics, where do customers use the native tools, specifically within AWS or Azure or GCP, or do do they use a framework that can provide them portability?
Hmm.
Are you seeing that much with, because I've looked into some
Yeah.
of these tools, but if a customer builds and they work on a project and it's all IoT or AWS IoT, but if they have a change in policy or something happens where they want to shift to Azure, you
Hmm.
know, I'm assuming like when I've looked at like HD Insights versus AWS EMR that it's a,
Hmm.
hey, we've got to build from the ground up. There's no kind of export. So is that a
Yeah.
concern in IoT, or is it, hey, these tools are so good we couldn't put Kubernetes on top of this and build it ourselves and just run it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's a larger general question that people ask pretty frequently about their infrastructure is, um, do I use managed services? Do I use cloud services and get the benefits that they're offering in terms of, not having to develop a lot of things ourselves? Do I try and do more work ourselves so we can decide where it lives later on? Um, I'm kind of biased coming from the serverless world and a lot of those things where I see a lot of the benefits of using managed services in terms of
Yeah.
total cost of ownership. Where you think about, okay, what's the real cost of everything that you're doing? Well, a lot of it is developer time. It's not just compute cost.
Yeah.
And if you think about that, do I want to spend $1 million getting $1 million on developers, getting up my Kubernetes infrastructure running, getting everything going there, just in terms of the experience? Because if you think about it, the number of people, I mean, maybe Kubernetes has become a lot easier since the last time I checked, but if you want to get a production level infrastructure running, you're going to spend a lot on people to get it going. And the idea, at least behind the kind of managed services realm, is, well, okay, well, we don't have to take all of this infrastructure experience and leverage it just to build our to do app. Instead, we can jump right in and get it going with a little bit less overhead in terms of infrastructure. I think that applies pretty similarly to IoT, with maybe one more caveat that once you deploy your devices into the field, you have to have a really good story for updating the software on those if you plan to do any sort of migration. Because if you think about it, a lot of those devices are going to be uh, given variables and configurations and applications that are all going to be pointing towards some piece of infrastructure. And if you want to change it in the long run, you have to be really careful that you're doing it correctly, or else you end up bricking, all of your devices. So that sort of massive migration is something that makes me pretty hesitant, especially in the IoT space. It's definitely possible, but you really have to think about it thoroughly before you embark on that and have a set of benefits that you're going to get out of it first.
Yeah, I mean,